I wrote about child welfare and educational well-being of children in the child welfare system. And I'm writing about a particular a legal conception or legal technology, corporate parenthood, that has been important in forming the way we think about the responsibilities of child protection towards the kids in their care. And I think it's a sort of something of a statement of the obvious. I hope so, that child welfare, because I'm not going to explore it in too much length, the child welfare authorities engage with families not only through the provision of services, but also through the use of legal technologies, which have the role of constructing, reconstructing, and enforcing relationships of care. And as we know, technologies are rarely neutral. So in this paper, I'm looking at the way family relationships are regulated through the concept of corporate parenthood of the Crown, which is the notion that there's a division between the legal and the physical responsibilities for the flourishing of children when kids are involved in the child welfare system. And my focus is particularly on the Crown's very extra-ambiguous responsibilities towards children who receive services from child welfare but remain with their families, right? And before I start, I wanted to provide a bit of background information both about the system of child welfare in Ontario and about the research on which I'm drawing. So the Ontario system is regulated by the Child and Family Services Act. It has three paramount purposes. One is the best interest of the child, one is the protection of the child, and the third, vastly overshadowed one, is the well-being of children. There are 46 children's aid agencies, there's 9,000 children's aid workers in Ontario. It's a big, big system, hard to run. Perhaps contrary to most people's expectations, Canada-wide, only about 8% of child protection investigations ever lead to an out-of-home placement. So the vast majority of children in the child welfare system stay with their parents. And we have, I would say, a huge void in our understanding of the obligations of the child welfare system to the children who are staying with their parents during a time of ongoing child welfare services. In its Child Welfare Transformation Plan, which is old now, 2005, the Ontario government clearly acknowledges that these kids, while maybe not in the kind of immediate crisis that would warrant removing them from parental care, do face comparable long-term vulnerability. So, let's see if I can, no? Come on, I'll see. I'm really not smooth. So this paper draws on research I did actually a couple of years ago for my book, which is Succeeding Together, Schools, Child Welfare, and Uncertain Public Responsibility for Abused and Neglected Children. The book is an institutional ethnography where I explore the general concept of collective responsibility as it's distributed both between families and child welfare and schools. How do we explore this problem of many hands and public accountability there? It's based on linked and unlinked interviews with mothers, frontline child welfare workers, teachers, and policy leaders in the sector. I did in-depth interviews with 57 people, including 8 mothers with recent child welfare experience for the book. And I used the approach of institutional ethnography because it's a methodology that starts with what people tell you about their lives, but in the words of Dorothy Smith, is not meant as a way of discovering the everyday world as such, but of looking beyond the everyday to discover how it comes to happen as it does. So as a methodology, it's particularly appropriate for studies of decentered, shall we call it, regulatory activities where there's not just formal rules and practices, but informal rules and processes that kind of bind rulemaking and compliance and what goes on together in a social interaction setting. So that's the background onto the theory. At the heart of child welfare services is a split in the responsibilities of parenting. This split has been theorized by a group of leading child welfare experts from both Britain and the US who suggest that and what I'm going to do, this is my way of managing length, I'm going to put long blocks of text up there. And you can either read them or not, depending. I'm kind of going to vaguely refer to them. So these guys suggest that in the context of the child welfare, different facets of parenthood, the legal, the social, the psychological, and biological, are divided between the state and those actually providing the care. When a child becomes a ward in the child protection system, when custody transfers, physical custody is delegated to substitute caregivers who are responsible for ensuring children get, these are the things they point to, affection, nurture, control, partisanship, unqualified aid in times of emergencies, and other people who focus more on parenting also mention work and continual relationships. So the state in this setting retains the responsibility of, quote, seeking to ensure that all these aspects of parenting are provided in a coherent way. But this theory doesn't address at all, and I haven't found it elsewhere, the responsibility of the state to the majority of the children in the system, and that is those who remain with their parents. For these children, there is significant ambiguity in terms of the responsibilities of the state. And we can think about it in the protection context that has just been so vividly brought forward, but I'm only going to talk about well-being. And, the child welfare workers who you would talk to would say, we have a really hard time getting to well-being. And some of the reasons for that are obvious, right? But I would say the ambiguity about the responsibility of the state for the children who stay at home is the almost impregnable ideological construct of assumed comprehensive parental responsibility. In my interviews, mothers, child welfare workers, policy officials, they all saw parental responsibility as undiminished and unchanged where the children stayed at home. Indeed, except for potential transitional supports, child welfare's key role is defined as scrutinizing and enforcing the responsibilities of the parents, usually the mothers. While interviews with professionals tend to frame CAS as a safety net for children, when the children were facing key challenges obtaining supports, be it decent housing or necessary advocacy and schooling, their main safety net continued to be their family, mostly their mothers. The mothers provided that support under a system of very sharp accountability, where their failures, when they occur, and they do, could lead to extreme consequences up to and including removal of children. But at the same time, if the state doesn't provide services or supports or coordination that may be also necessary for children's well-being, there is almost non-existent accountability. So it's a great asymmetry there, and this follows on the work of Karen Swift and others. I would argue that the gap emerges from a weak conception of public responsibility for abused and neglected children who remain at home. So I asked people about it. Most system leaders, when you ask them, they struggle to define the relationship between government and the children in the community. I was, again, surprised by this. I thought someone must have thought about it. But these are like the provincial advocate for children and youth, I don't know. The head of services for a very large children's aid society, not so clear. So some would articulate that the responsibility is the same in principle, but admit that service doesn't live up to that. Others would say, actually, we aren't even thinking about what our responsibility to these children are, which is amazing. What accounts for it? To define state responsibility in this context requires both agencies and workers to wrestle with ideologies of the family and very genuine practical constraints. So you talk to frontline children's services workers, and they will point to resource shortages and the need to focus on high-risk child protection needs instead of the nice-to-haves like well-being. Another policy leader described being guided by the principle of minimal intrusiveness, which is an American doctrine based on the sanctity of the family. It's like, well, we shouldn't be there because we should stay out unless we have to be there for protection. And many workers talked quite sympathetically about taking the parental perspective of wanting to limit what are often unwanted intrusions in family life, unless they felt it was critical for safety. And one talked to me about, like, if I start asking for report cards, they're going to be what? You're going to take my kid if they're not doing well in school? So a real concern that that's actually going to create major dynamic issues. And several of the mothers I talked to said they wanted as little as possible to do with child welfare and would prefer to handle problems on their own. But A lack of a robust conception of public responsibility, or at very best, an ambiguous one, does make a difference in terms of the stretched environment of child protection work. It has an impact on policy, on practice, and opportunities for advocacy for children in the community, and it is reflected in the accountability structures of the system, or the lack of them. So my research provided a case study of how this lacuna makes a difference for the children in the area of education. And I won't go into details, but there are big educational outcomes gaps, participation gaps, attendance gaps, high levels of special ed involvement, high levels of discipline problems. These are very genuine needs. Education, as we all know, is a key determinant of health and well-being and a centrally important developmental environment for children. Hopefully, it might even represent a pathway to opportunity and a better future. So I think we should be concerned about schools. At the policy level, there's been a considerable emphasis on improving the educational experiences and outcomes for children in the child welfare system, particularly over the last decade. So a list of initiatives that have been undertaken through really, you see the people working on it, really hard work to bring together big different ministries and schools and bureaucracies galore. These efforts have by and large been strictly limited to children who are actually in the care of the child welfare system. Only the last point, this new joint protocols, extends to children in the community in the cases where child welfare chooses to tell the school that the child is receiving services because they're afraid they'll be stigmatized by the schools. At the level of practice, there are also significant differences. In the last few years, many CASs have hired education advocates, usually retired school principals, to help support kids in the child welfare system. I talked to 5 of them across a range of CASs. The overwhelming majority of their efforts go to meet the very real needs of kids in care. They run sessions to teach foster parents how to manage the school system because they know how hard it is. They don't offer those to parents of kids in the community. No educational advocate could think of a case where a child in the community received tutoring to help them fill gaps in schools. Several workers talked about CAS getting psychoeducational assessments to help speed up special education processes. In some circumstances, no one could think of kids in the community getting those services. Furthermore, unfortunately, there's lots of evidence that the bureaucracy works better with advocacy efforts and that skilled efforts make a difference. And I would say that, again, the workers I talked to were very appreciative of parental passion in advocating, but even in saying that, and not willing to take no for an answer, and some of the things that we bring to the system as parent advocates, but they did say it makes a difference if the institution gets involved on your behalf, which is why I'm so concerned to see that the Commission on Sustainable Child Welfare is saying we've got to get out of this advocacy game. We should just be assuming the other public services are doing a good job for children. It's terribly alarming. And I had a great story I'd tell you, never mind. Cumulatively, it adds up to a picture of weak and very discretionary supports for well-being in the area of education for these children. In the context of Crown wards, there is a growing push to make sure they receive supports described by one scholar as those that would be provided by adequately informed and well-resourced parents in the community. At this point, there is no emerging standard of provision for children involved with child welfare who actually live in the community. I would further argue that even with children who stay with their parents, once the child when children stay with their parents, once child welfare system has decided there's a need for protection, warranting its involvement, it has taken on a responsibility. And in the words of Parker, Courtney, and Bullock from that first slide, that responsibility includes seeking to ensure all aspects of parenting are provided in some kind of coherent way, a commitment that surely involves providing ongoing support to children and families for which they should be held accountable. 3 points on the lack of accountability, because I'm out of time. No appeal rights in the service area. Only substantive review of services provided comes through court. 95% of cases never go to court. Child and youth advocate is not, kids who don't go into care aren't required to be told about the child and youth advocate. So he doesn't get complaints from them, surprise, surprise, and has never done a systemic review of their distinct issues. There is a great lack of accountability for the needs of these kids, and I think it's a really important well-being issue that helps us think hard about the boundary between private and public in a problematic way. Oh, and I had a pretty picture to end us with. There's collective responsibility helping us soar.